going to look at evaluating national income statistics and green GDP. These are the two concepts that we are going to study today. First one is evaluating national income statistics. So here basically we are looking at why GDP, GNI do not accurately measure the true value of output. There are some cases where GDP or GNI do not capture the true picture of an economy. The first case is GDP, GNI do not include non-marketed output. So, what is non marketed output? You have produced some goods and services which are not sold in the market. That is either used for example, you have a piece of land where you produce, let's say, rice, and you use that rice for your own consumption, and you are not selling that rice which you have produced in your land in the market. So, this is non marketed output. Likewise, you do some work at home. For example, you do some plumbing work at home, which are not counted in GDP. If you have hired a plumber, you would have paid him some amount, but then if you are doing the same job that a plumber could have done, then that's an unpaid work that's done at home. So these are the things that are non-marketed output in an economy. So value of goods and services that are not sold in the market are not included in GDP. For example, unpaid work at home, as I told you, the plumbing work that you do at home, and agriculture production for self-consumption. So you have piece of land, you produce rice, and you keep it for yourself and your family's consumption. So these are not included in GDP, GNI. For example, here in Bangladesh, women do four times more unpaid work than men. So, household work like this are not included in GDP. And so, this is an estimation of monetary value of unpaid domestic work in the same country, Bangladesh. So, you can take a look at this. Likewise, any agriculture production for own consumption like this will not be uh, included in GDP. Okay, so that's the first limitation of GDP and GNI and other national income statistics. The second limitation is GDP, GNI do not include output sold in underground market. So underground market is also known as parallel market. Um, so for example, drugs and other things that are sold in underground market, or anything that is not shown to the government, will not be included in GDP and GNI. For example, this is the case of South Korea, where underground economy accounted for 8% of GDP in 2015, and the transactions in underground economy keeps growing over a period of time. I think it keeps decreasing over a period of time. And likewise, in developed countries as well, you have underground economy operating. So this is the statistics related to some of the European countries and the US. Okay. And the next one is GDP and GNI do not take into account quality improvements in goods and services. Um, while GDP and GNI measure the country's level of income or output, they do not capture any quality improvements. For example, you take a just take a look at this picture. This phone with all these features is sold at 11,000 rupees. Some years ago you would have bought a mobile at the same price with some other features. Maybe in the configuration, or the RAM was little less, little smaller. Here it is 6 GB and 64 GB, and then this 48 MP camera and all that. So this is basically the quality improvement. For the same price, the mobile phone that you would have bought for the same price some years ago would not have similar features that you are getting now. So such quality improvements are not included in GDP calculations. The next one is GDP, GNI do not account for the value of negative externalities such as pollution, toxic waste, and other undesirable byproducts of production. um, so GDP means, you produce goods and services, and as you experience, as the country experiences higher GDP growth, the country is producing more goods and services. So in the process of producing more goods and services, the country is also polluting the environment. For example, in China, where there is a rapid economic growth over a period of time, you also have a pollution in the process of economic growth. So you can take a look at this picture and then understand the air pollution caused by. Next one is GDP and GNI and differing domestic price levels. uh, in each country in the world, you have different price levels. I mean, the prices are different in each country in the world. uh, so this makes the international comparison of GDP and GNA statistics very difficult. But then we have a solution. If you can take a common product which is sold in different countries, and if you can express the price of this product in a common currency, then we can understand the purchasing power in different countries. For example, here in this picture, it is the same iPhone model sold in these countries. um, Japan, USA, and Italy. And so the price is expressed in common currency, which is US dollar here. And what we can understand is the price of iPhone is the lowest in Japan among these three countries. And what we can understand is that Japan has higher purchasing power of the currency US dollar when compared to the other countries. So this is how we eliminate any price difference difficulties that we face when we compare GDPs of different. Okay, so the next one is why GDP GNI cannot accurately measure standards of living. These are the reasons why GDP and GNI cannot accurately measure standards of living. The first one is GDP or GNI make no distinctions about the composition of output. A country might be growing well in terms of GDP growth, but then if the country is producing more and more weapons and producing less and less merit goods, then it's easy to understand that the country is not progressing in terms of standard of living. So if a country has high GDP and spends more on weapons while spending less on merit goods, the standard of living may not be truly higher. In countries like Russia, the amount that is spent on the production of weapons is much higher when compared to maybe some of the merit goods like health and education and all that. Because Russia is one of the exporters of weapons in the global market. So when the country is spending, or when the country is producing too much weapons, and when it is producing, or when it is spending less on education and healthcare, then you cannot think that the country is progressing in terms of standard of living and all that. So such things are not captured in GDP and GNA statistics. It only looks at the value of goods and services produced in a country. It doesn't look at which goods and services are produced in a country. Okay, so the next one is GDP GNI cannot reflect achievements in levels of education, health, and life expectancy. So if you take a look at this picture, you can understand the difference between the healthcare system between these two countries, the US and its neighbor, Cuba. Though US is considered to be a richer country than Cuba, the healthcare system in Cuba is better than the healthcare system in the US. Because in the US you have to insure yourself for any medical care and all that, but in Cuba the healthcare is a human right, the basic human right. It's free and universal, and So you can also understand the difference between the healthcare system in these two countries. Okay. Uh, Next one is GDP, GNI do not provide information on the distribution of income and output. So this is India's GDP per capita over period of time from 2009 to 2019. So you can look at the graph how it is how it has been growing over a period of time. Okay, so this data tells you India's growing GDP per capita. But then, just by looking at India's GDP per capita figure, you cannot come to a conclusion that country is actually doing well. While the GDP per capita has been growing steadily in India, India's inequality also has been growing steadily over a period of time. So there's a picture of Aslam in Mumbai, and then you can also look at how the inequality is present in a city like Mumbai. Okay, so the next one is GDP and GNI do not take into account increased leisure. So the more leisure time that you have means you have better standard of living. You are able to spend time with your family members and your near and dear ones. So this indicates more leisure time indicates better standard of living. Globally, the average work hours have decreased over a period of time, and leisure time has increased. This indicates increased standard of living. However, such things are not captured in GDP or GNI. So, such quality aspects are not included or not considered when we calculate GDP and GNI. A country, let's say there are two countries which have similar GDP numbers, but then in one country the leisure time is more. So naturally, the standard of living in that country will be higher than the other country which has lesser leisure time. The next one is GDP and GNI do not account for quality of life factors. These days, as countries are trying to grow more and more economically, there are also the other problems like stress, depression, and other things related to work. So these things are not captured by GDP and GNI. So you can just take a look at this picture. So South Korea is one of the countries which are which is doing quite well over a period of time. Its GDP growth is much better than India and other countries. But then this is the news which has appeared about South Korea. So people are undergoing depression and stress related to work and all that. And likewise in Japan, though it is considered as one of the developed countries in the world, so the work culture there is very very difficult. I mean, people work longer hours and spend lesser time at home, and so employees die in Japan because of work pressure. So this was the news that has appeared in one of the news websites. So just by looking at GDP numbers of these countries, you cannot come to conclusion that the country is truly doing well. If there are many people suffering from stress, depression, and all that, maybe you can understand that the quality of living in such countries is not as better as some of the other countries. Okay. The next thing is difficulty in the comparison of GDP, GNI. So when you try to compare GDP or GNA numbers over a period of time, for example, India's GDP in 2019 and India's GDP in 2002, if you're trying to compare these two GDP figures, you will face some difficulties because such comparisons are likely to be misleading as several aspects such as quality improvements in products, improvements in healthcare and education, changes in leisure time are not included in such comparisons. For example, India's GDP between these two periods, 2002 and 2019, would have increased by 4%. But then just by looking at this number you cannot come to a conclusion, because over a period of time there is a quite lot of changes in terms of quality improvements in many products. For example, the computer that you used in 2002 had the configuration was different, and if you're buying the same if you're buying a computer at the same price in 2019, the configuration or the quality improvement today is entirely different. So even though the price seems to be the same, you are getting a better product these days than what you got in 2002. So these things are not captured in GDP, and that makes the comparison over time difficult. Okay, the next one is comparison between countries. So when you try to compare GDP figures between different countries, you face some limitations. So such limitations can be explained through this example. So you have country A and country B, and GDP per capita in country A is $1,000, and GDP per capita in country B is $700. Uh, However, the income inequality in country A, where you have higher GDP per capita, is very very high. But then the country B, which has lower GDP per capita, the income inequality is very low. And which country is in a better position? Obviously, country B. So just by looking at GDP per capita, you cannot come to a conclusion that the country is actually doing. You also have to look at other aspects like income inequality and so many other aspects, and then only by looking at these aspects you will be able to understand country's true position. Okay, so that part is understood. So far what we discussed was about the limitations of national income statistics like GDP and GNA measurements. That's about the limitations of GDP and GNI. So now we are going to look at green GDP. Green GDP these days became more and more important because of global warming and environmental degradation, and then so many other environmental disasters and all that. So green GDP is used to capture environmental degradation caused by economic growth. And this is how we calculate green GDP. Green GDP is equal to GDP minus the value of environmental degradation. When the country is growing economically, it is also causing so much damage to the environment. So if you detect such if you can give some monetary value to such environmental damage or environmental degradation, and if you deduct that from GDP, what you get is green GDP. So green GDP is basically GDP minus the value of environmental degradation. For example, if you look at this picture, this is picture of Malaysia, which is one of the major exporters of palm oil. But then, in order to produce more and more palm oil, what's happening in Malaysia is more and more um, forests are cleared for the cultivation of palm oil. So that has severe environmental cost in the country. So the rainfall over a period of time has been declining. The average rainfall in the country has been declining, and then so many other problems are there when you actually clear the forest and use that land for palm oil production. So that's an example. Um, and apart from just detecting the value of environmental degradation, what we also do is we also detect this amount P. So what is P? Um P is basically all expenditures resulting from cleaning up pollution and healthcare costs of pollution induced illness. So Already I explained that when you deduct the value of environmental degradation from GDP, what you get is a green GDP. In addition to that, if you also deduct these expenditures resulting from cleaning up pollution and healthcare costs, so you truly get to understand the green GDP value. For example, in India, the river Ganges is highly polluted, and the government spends so much amount on cleaning this river. So such amount, all the amount that is spent on cleaning this river, if it is deducted from this, and also the healthcare cost of illness induced by pollution, then what you get is green GDP. For example, here there is a predicted increase in health related costs due to air pollution globally. So, due to air pollution, the healthcare cost is in 2015 is this much amount globally, and in 2060 it is predicted to be this much amount. And working days lost due to air pollution in 2015 is this much, and in 2060 this much. So, this is basically the healthcare cost of air pollution. So if you include this and if you include this, uh, and then if you, together, if you add both these costs and then deduct these values from GDP, what you get is green GDP. So green GDP, in complete form, is basically the GDP minus the value of environmental degradation minus P, which is all expenditures resulting from cleaning up pollution and healthcare costs of pollution induced illness. Okay, so that's all for today. So we basically covered um, two things. The first one is evaluating national income statistics, and these are the limitations that we discussed while evaluating GDP and GNI statistics. Um, and we also looked at what is green GDP, because green GDP these days is very very important because of environmental degradation caused by high economic growth. So in green GDP, what you do is you take GDP value and you deduct the value of environmental degradation, and you also deduct all expenditures resulting from cleaning up pollution and healthcare costs of pollution induced illness. So after detecting all these things, what you get is green GDP. Okay, so that's all for today, and meet you in the next class, students.